Hi, Roz. Okay, we're all set. Oh, that's my thumb. Okay, you're all set.
Okay. What I did with my papers.
Yeah, that means that many people went before, because it said this trip is limited to those who never gone before.
Okay, we're down to the hardcore. The 6 stalwarts, thank you for coming. Okay. Okay, so I'm on speaker. Speakers view. Okay. Okay, so if one were to ask about the co-rushes of Cyrus's view in terms of Jewish history, what would you say? He was generally positive, generally negative, what? Positive? Okay. We'll see that should be questioned. I don't know why.
I happen to read it. I did read it.
But are you ready to take a test?
I read what I picked up at home. No, it's not this form, but
Okay.
whatever I got last time, I read it.
Okay, so I put the years before you to remind you. There's a long gap from when Cyrus until they sort of built the base of Mikdash, and then we'll see what did they accomplish. Okay, 538 was the first Aliyah. That's almost 50 years from the destruction of the temple in 587.
Yeah.
And then
I remember 586.
again, I don't know.
Okay.
They didn't have good calendars those days. I mean, they often debate when the king's year actually started. So, because calendars were not the same as we think of them in terms of it. I mean, it's like the Chinese have a different New Year, the Muslims have a different New Year when they say, oh, I forgot, we have 7. It's an opening mission in Rosh Hashanah. So the definition of New Year is very variable. So how you count is often a challenge. But again, 586, 587, I'll give you the year.
The ninth of all we accept.
Yes, except for one problem. At least the Gemara doesn't believe both temples were destroyed in the 9th of Av. I can't do anything about it.
Okay.
That's what it says. They decided they would use one for both times. It was in Av, but it wasn't necessarily the 9th of Av. But that's beyond today. Okay, so I just wanted to read the sentences. So Ezra starts out with Cyrus. Okay, does anyone have a good voice willing to read instead of me doing all the reading? Sure. Ezra, yeah.
In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, the word of the Lord spoken to Jeremiah was fulfilled, and the Lord roused the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia to issue a proclamation throughout his realms by word of mouth and in writing as follows. Thus saith King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has charged me with building in a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Any one of you, of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem that is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord, God of Israel, the God that is in Jerusalem.
Okay, so one of the things it's important to understand is that we don't envision God being in one particular place. He may be easier to reach, but that's not how the world thought of gods. They thought the gods were really in specific locations. And specifically, Cyrus thinks he's only the God of Israel, not the God of the world. And he happens to spend most of his time in Yerushalayim. He wasn't necessarily everywhere, and he wanted them to build what? In Hebrew, it livnos lo vayit b'Yerushalayim asher b'Yehuda. And also the God they talk about is the God of heaven, which means he may not be that involved with things on earth. Okay, but he specifically wanted them to build a bias in Yerushalayim. What he didn't mention, I mentioned it before, there's nothing about Yerushalayim, there's nothing about the state of Israel, just to build a bias for God in Jerusalem. And specifically in the tribe of Judah, Yehuda, make it clear. Okay. So a year after they initiated it, in Tishrei they built an altar, they started celebrating Karbanos with holidays, and like often happens, Chag Sukkos is a very great time for being around the base of Mikdash because there's Karbanos every day, different amounts. And the point I've made, following up on Rabbi Angel, is that everything seems to be people initiated, not leadership initiated. The leaders supported it, but they weren't really the driving force behind anything. And it specifically says they didn't make any effort to build a foundation. They were just going to, so they started out by just building an altar. That's it. Okay, page 2. Okay, so in the starting point, in the first year, they come Rosh Hashanah, they bring Karbanos, they build an altar. Chazal deal with the issue of how you have an altar without a base of Mikdash and where they put it, but they built it. That's it. And at the end of that time, it says they did not lay a foundation. But then in chapter 3, which is the year afterwards, okay, you did such a fine job. We'll recruit you again.
When the builders had laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord.
Okay, one second.
First you put the foundation, then the temple.
No, this is already chapter 3.
Yes.
So yes, in chapter 1 was when they built the altar, and they didn't build anything besides the altar. 2 chapters later, in the second year, is when they build the foundation. Okay.
Nothing happens in chapter 2.
What?
Nothing happens in chapter 2.
Well, there is things that happen in chapter 2. We covered it, but
Okay. When the builders had laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, priests in their vestments with trumpets, and Levite sons of Asaph with cymbals were stationed to give praise to the Lord, as King David of Israel had ordained.
okay, so that's an important point. We tend to link Shlomo Melch with the temple because he actually built it. But David HaMelech is what they're linking it to, because Shlomo's end days were not very good for a Beis HaMikdash. He built all sorts of other temples overlooking the Beis HaMikdash. You can blame it on his wives, but he did build lots of other temples. Go ahead.
Okay.
He sang songs.
They sang songs extolling and praising the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love for Israel is eternal.
Okay, the phrase in Hebrew, Vayanu b'hala v'hodos Hashem ki tov ki v'olam chasto. Ki tov v'olam chasto. Pretty common phrase.
All the people raised a great shout, extolling the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord had been laid. Many of the priests and Levites and the chiefs of the clans, the old men who had seen the first house, wept loudly at the sight of the founding of this house. Many others shouted joyously at the top of their voices.
Okay, so you're beginning to sense there's a mixed feeling about, is this in any way really fulfilling Yirmiyahu's vision or Chestel's vision of a second temple? So they weren't sure. Some of them, the older ones, were ambivalent. It starts out, they sang in verse 11, for his good, his steadfast love is eternal, and yet they're mixed. Okay, that's chapter 3, and also in chapter 2 is the list of all the people came to Eretz Yisrael.
When laugh meant that they were sad,
Yes,
or that they were touched. Could be both.
could be.
I think they remember the grandeur of the Christian.
Okay, well,
Right. But they could have been touched. Yeah. But
okay.
that is fine. We have
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I mean, we use the phrase cried for joy. I'm trying to see if the word bocheh in Hebrew was ever associated with joy. I don't know. I don't know in modern language. So the word bocheh is not necessarily, again, in English we say, cried with joy, but that doesn't mean there's an equivalent translation in Hebrew. Okay, so what happens in chapter 4?
I mean, but the foundation, you're saying was smaller than.
Well, right now we have no sense of what it is, but it's probably very small. But it doesn't go very far, so don't worry about it. In that second year, the people around them hear about what's going on, and they come to volunteer and they want to help build the base of Mikdash. They say, we pray to your God as well. Again, monotheism was not, very common, and people believed in all sorts of gods. There's no problem praying to the God of Israel and also praying to the God of Canaan. Except that the offer was rejected by the leadership. And what do they then do? They initiate a bad-mouth political campaign, and construction stops. This is only a year. They didn't even make much progress besides building a foundation. And who authorized the stopping? The guy that we praise, Koresh. They stopped building it. He gave them the authority, but when he had local, I've tried to draw numerous analogies, right, to what happened in 1880, 1917. People authorize the Jews to do something. The locals get upset. They file a complaint with the original people, and somehow nothing is allowed to get done.
So is that the reason they stopped?
Yeah.
Because the neighbors.
Yeah, okay, you can read the next box.
Continue?
No, I have an American flag going to read.
Okay.
Thereupon the people of the land undermined the result of the people of Judah and made them afraid to build. They bribed ministries in order to thwart their plans all the years of King Cyrus of Persia and until the reign of King Darius of Persia. And in the reign of Ahasuerus, at the start of his reign, they drew up an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. And in the time of Artaxerxes, whatever,
Right? That's
and
whatever.
the rest of their colleagues wrote to King Artaxerxes of Persia a letter written in Aramaic.
Okay.
and
So this paragraph, I stumbled on it because I forgot. This paragraph, Ezra, in writing this chapter, decided he wouldn't stick with only chronologically what happened the first time. He wanted to lay out the framework, what was going to happen for the next 50, 60 years. Okay? So he says, yes, they started with King Cyrus and they bribed him, but it went on into King Darius of Persia. They were still doing the same thing. It's like, again, the Palestinians or whatever, when the Jews were trying to move in, it didn't matter who the government was, they were constantly complaining to the governments, the Ottoman Empire, whoever it was, to not let the Jews do anything very much. And this is what they were doing. No matter who the king was, they filed formal complaints.
That was the reason, because they didn't want the house of.
Yeah, they didn't want it. And again, they could see what would happen. They didn't want a Jewish center with power. They knew Yerushalayim was the center of whatever power is. Apparently, they didn't complain about the village because, as you and I know, Israel was often desolate. So going back to a village that nobody occupied didn't bother them. And in those days, there was not necessarily a concept called a country. We take for granted what the word country means, but from the little I remember from history, Germany wasn't a country, Italy wasn't a country for a long time until they. So to say that Israel was a country is a euphemism. They were a collection of villages. So they weren't opposed to somebody moving into a village nearby. Population, and all of these were not first generation people there either. They had been brought there by Sancheriv. So they were willing to let them live by, but they didn't want to have some public thing, and especially since they weren't allowed to participate. Right? Because they weren't allowed to participate, it's a standard thing. The Jews want to be by themselves. They don't want to interact with it. People don't often get happy by that. So they were not too thrilled by the reaction of the people.
Well, it says the rebellion and lost taxes.
Okay. So will you stop reading ahead? That's my wife. Okay. So one of the things that confused me, there's a whole long letter which gives you a sense of what type of things they wrote. And I thought it was the first letter. No, this is the last letter they wrote. It doesn't tell us what they wrote about Cyrus or Darius or Achashverosh. This is the letter at the time of Artaxerxes, and it's after Achashverosh, and it's in Aramaic, so there's no real value to trying to put the text in front of you. So this is the last letter they wrote, but it can give you a sense. This is what they've been trying all along. The logic that they had was the same. Rabbi Chelst, are you up to it?
Why not?
Page 3.
To King Artaxerxes from your servants, men of the province beyond the river.
That's Ava Hanoha, remember, that's the phrase. But it was an actual state or region called Ava Hanoha. It didn't mean just going across the river. It was an area called Ava Hanoha.
Be it known to the king that the Jews who came up from you to us have reached Jerusalem and are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are completing the walls and repairing the foundation. Now be it known to the king that if this city is rebuilt and the walls completed, they will not pay tribute, poll tax, or land tax, and in the end it will harm the kingdom. This city is a rebellious city, harmful to kings and states. Sedition has been rife in it from early times on account the city was destroyed. If this city is rebuilt and its walls are completed, you will no longer have any portion in the province beyond the river. At my order, a search has
Now this is the king responding.
right. At my order, a search has been made, and it has been found that this city has from earliest times risen against kings, and that rebellion and sedition have been rife in it. Powerful kings have ruled over Jerusalem and exercised authority over the whole province of beyond the river, and tribute, poll tax, and land tax will pay to them. Now issue an order to stop these men. This city is not to be rebuilt until I so order. At that time, work on the house of God in Jerusalem stopped and remained in abeyance until the second year of the reign of King Darius.
Okay, so there's actually a mixture in here because they're two separate things. There's one building Yerushalayim, and there's another thing building the temple. So we know the first Avi had made no effort to build Yerushalayim. The attempt to build Yerushalayim didn't happen until Nehemiah and Ezra came. They were just trying to build the temple, but they didn't even get that far until the 18th year, and they needed inspiration. Okay, so they're mixing things together. Artaxerxes would have been the time about when Nehemiah came. So they're talking about building Yerushalayim. And building Yerushalayim is a much more symbolic statement. It's like a capital of a kingdom than building just a temple. You can build a temple anywhere. It doesn't mean as much as building a city. Okay, so everything stopped. But as I said, this covers 180 to 100 year period. So now the next chapter goes back. But before we read the other chapter, it's one of the rare times we have Nevi'im totally aligned with text and what's in the, Tammy, are you up to it? Haggai, page 4.
In the 7th year of King Darius, the first day of the 6th month, this word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, the governor of Yehuda, and to Yehoshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and the high priest, Yehoshua, son of Jehozadak, and all the rest of the people gave heed to the summons of the Lord their God and to the words of prophet Haggai. When the Lord their God sent him, the people feared the Lord. And Haggai, the Lord's messenger, fulfilling the Lord's mission, spoke to the people. I am with you, declares the Lord. And then the Lord roused the spirit of Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, the governor of Yehuda, and the spirit of the high priest Yeshua, son of Yehoshaphat, and the spirit of the rest of the people. They came and set to work on the house of the Lord of hosts, their God, on the 24th day of the 6th month in the 2nd year of King Darius.
Okay, so this is in Haggai. Haggai is one chapter. His only purpose was to get the people to build the Beis Hamikdash. So Haggai is much more broad. He also talks about Mashiach. Probably the only official reference to a Mashiach in all of Tanakh is a guy riding on a donkey. That's in Zechariah.
Zerubbabel was appointed by.
Yeah, so Zerubbabel was one of the leaders who came.
Huh?
He came with the first Aliyah. So he's 18 years older, but he was a leader in the first Aliyah that came.
He's governor.
Well, son of the governor, yes, so he was governor of Judah.
He's self-appointed. He was appointed.
No, again, when they went on the basis of King Cyrus, Cyrus gave them some type of titles and official recognition. So he might have had the title governor of Judah, whatever that meant. He didn't offer him any power, but he felt he could go ahead, and there's no evidence that it led to a battle. We'll see, this is Haggai telling you, and Ezra tells you what happens on page 5 of 8. Okay, so who hasn't volunteered yet? Okay, page 5 of 8.
Then the prophet, Haggai the prophet, and Zechariah son of Edo, prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem, inspired by the God of Israel. Thereupon Zerubbabel son of Shealtiel and Yeshua son of
Tzadok.
began rebuilding the house of God in Jerusalem with the full support of the prophets of God. At once Tathenai, governor of the province of.
So this is the bigger area in response to what you asked about the governor of Judah. The real power was behind the governor of Ever HaNahar. Okay.
Bozani and their colleagues descended upon them and said this to them: Who issued orders to you to rebuild this house and complete its furnishing? Then he said to them, What are the names of the men who are engaged in the building? But God watched over the elders of the Jews, and they were not stopped. While a report went to Darius, and a letter was sent back in reply to him. This is the text of the letter that Tathenai, governor of the province of beyond the river, and Shethar-Bozenai and his colleagues, the officials of beyond the river, sent to King Darius. They sent a message to him and his.
Okay, so I wanted to show you to make sure that this is all in Aramaic. So I decided to put the first verse from chapter 5. Visnabi Haggai Neviah Uzchaya Bar Ido Neviah Al Yehudeya De Bihud Vishoim Bishum Ella Yisrael Aleihon. It's all in Aramaic. We have 3 chapters in a row that are in Aramaic, and especially the next part, which tells you the actual letter. Right? There are not many times in Tanakh where you have a long letter written. I was always shocked when I discovered Yirmiyahu had this long letter to the people of Bavel, authorizing them to establish a Jewish community there. So I decided to give you a sense of what the political dynamic that's going on. Okay, so this case, it wasn't the people of the land who were initiating it. Who tried to stop them or question them? It was the lead power in the area, the governor over the entire province of Ever HaNahar, which is everything west of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. He just wondered, what are you doing, people? Where did you get authority? Right? It's not, as I said, it's almost deja vu. How many times in Eretz Yisrael nowadays do you have, who gave you authority to build that house, or to build that shul, or to build this and this? So having authority to do certain things, and he questioned it. And then he had, in verse 4, he had a very nice. Now imagine you think you're going ahead and building it. What's the one thing you don't want somebody to do? Take down your name and say who's building it. So what does this governor do? Then he said, what are the names of the men who are engaged in the building? So he wanted to have a record of who was initiating this. It might have scared them a little. Ultimately, it didn't, because they're going to see the letter from Darius. Okay, on page 6 and on the letter. Oh, we're going very fast. Okay, hold on. And this is a. Okay. Another reader? Okay.
Be it known to the king that we went to the.
Okay, by the way, the phrase to King Darius, greetings and so forth is part of the letter.
To King Darius, greetings and so forth. Be it known to the king that we went to the province of Judah, to the house of the great God. It is being rebuilt of hewn stone, and wood is being laid in the walls. The work is being done with dispatch and is going well. Thereupon we directed this question to these elders: who issued orders to you to rebuild this house and to complete its furnishings? We also asked the names so that we could write down the names of their leaders for your information. This is what they answered us: we are the servants of the God of heaven and earth.
Okay, so they're not limiting to the God of heaven, which is what the Babylonians are always using, right?
We are rebuilding the house that was originally built many years ago. The great king of Israel built it and completed it. But because our fathers angered the God of heaven, he handed them over to Nebuchadnezzar, the Chaldean, king of Babylon, who demolished this house and exiled the people to Babylon. But in the first year of King Cyrus of Babylon, King Cyrus issued an order to rebuild this house of God. Also the silver and gold vessels of the house of God that Nebuchadnezzar had taken away from the temple in Jerusalem and brought to the temple in Babylon. King Cyrus released them from the temple in Babylon to be given to the one called Sheshbazzar.
Okay, so there's another name, and the question is, are they the same people? Zerubbabel and Sheshbazzar. So it's a discussion of who he was.
To Sheshbazzar, whom he had appointed governor. He said to him, take these vessels, go, deposit them in the temple in Jerusalem, and let the house of God be rebuilt on its original site. That same Sheshbazzar that came and laid the foundations for the house of God in Jerusalem, and ever since then it has been under construction, but is not yet finished. And now, if it please the king, let the royal archives there in Babylon be searched to see whether indeed an order had been issued by King Cyrus to rebuild this house of God in Jerusalem. May the king convey to us his pleasure in this matter.
Okay, so they're claiming to have the authority. It goes back to the original. Now, this time, Cyrus is no longer king. I mean, he only ruled approximately 10 years, I think. After him came another king that is not mentioned in Tanakh for another 8 years. And comes King Darius, the first, whatever you want to call him, the first King Darius, who is known to be a builder. And he gets this letter. And the people themselves had already said, you should go check in the royal archives. Okay, so the king initiates it. This is chapter 6. Okay. We can come back to the original reader.
It refers to King.
This is the letter. So I wanted to give you a sense. And this also gets to the issue of how big were they going to build it. Okay.
Refers to him as king of Babylon. But
Right.
he was, king of Persia.
Okay, so one of the important things in all of ancient history is you always wanted to link your roots back to the previous, that you were a continuation of something going on. That was great. So he didn't necessarily call himself king of Persia. He wanted to be rooted in the king of Babylon, in terms of like the Babylon was the power and he was just a continuation of it, and he was not a usurper. So it's not uncommon to have things like that.
This was all written in Aramaic.
This is all in Aramaic. This is the letter. They print the letter. Thereupon, at the order.
Thereupon, on the order of King Darius, they searched the archives where the treasures were stored in Babylon.
Okay, so they first go to the standard archives, and they don't find anything. Page 7 of 8.
But it was in the city.
Can I just ask a question?
Okay, 1 second. Alan?
Yes, I would ask you, since I have a Tanakh and Hebrew in front of me and nothing else, could you give me the chapter and verse?
Yeah, chapter 6. We're reading the first 18 verses of chapter 6.
First verses of chapter 6. Thank you.
But it's a lot. It's the whole letter. the response of King Darius. Okay. Thereupon, at the order of King Darius, they searched the archives where the treasures were stored. That was his first location he went. Next.
But it was in the citadel of Ecbatana, in the province of Media, that a scroll was found in which the following was written. Memorandum. In the first year of King Cyrus issued an order concerning the house of God in Jerusalem. And let the house be rebuilt, a place for offering sacrifices, with a base built up high, that it be 60 cubits high and 60 cubits wide.
Okay, so cubits, I assume that means Amos, and Alan, does it say Amos in verse 4, verse 3?
Verse 4. Verse 4 says.
No, verse 3.
Verse 3.
Shishim.
1 second. Amin Shitin, exactly.
Yeah, okay, so an amma is roughly, for lack of a better number, 1.5 feet or something like that. 1.5 feet, right? So we're talking about, if it was really that, he authorized something that would be 90 feet wide by 90 feet. That's about, a quarter of and a 90-foot high building, which is very high, right? That doesn't mean that's what they built. He gave them authority to build something that big. That doesn't mean we have any sense that they actually built something. They wouldn't have had the resources to do it, okay? Go ahead, verse 4.
With a course of unused timber for each 3 courses of hewn stone. The expenses shall be paid by the palace, and the gold and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken away from the temple in Jerusalem, and transported to Babylon, shall be returned, and let each go back to the temple in Jerusalem where it belongs. You shall deposit it in the house of God.
Okay, so Cyrus is only focused on building this, again, the house of God. And this is what they find. Now it transitions to the current king, Darius, how he deals with having seen this letter.
Now you, Tatanai, governor of the province of beyond the river, Shethar-Bozenai and colleagues, and the officials of the province of beyond the river, stay away from that place. Allow the work of this house of God to go on. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God on its site. And I hereby issue an order concerning what you might do to help these elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God. The expenses are to be paid to these men with dispatch out of the resources of the king, derived from the taxes of the province of beyond the river, so that the work not be stopped.
So this king is, helpful. Cyrus had authorized also expenditures, but we don't have a sense that they actually happened because they were barely. But now this King Darius is putting all the power of the throne behind it. And also, Cyrus was the one who sent all the temple utensils back to Yerushalayim, which would have been in itself a permanent symbol that they had the right to build Yerushalayim because they had these vessels, right? But right, so okay, so it's always easier if you're not the person who captured the spoils. Okay, actually, in modern times we've seen that, right? Certain things that later presidents that were captured during World War II, and the famous one was something in Tennessee they found. I forgot what it was they had in Tennessee. There was something in Tennessee, and that was from Hungary, I think. They had a crown, Hungarian crown in Tennessee, and a later president decided to give it back. And we have the same debate going on about the paintings, all sorts of things. But yes, Nebuchadnezzar viewed it as his proof that his God was greater because he put all the things into his temple, the temple of his God. And Darius was much more liberal in terms of what he wanted, and he was prepared to support it. Now, in these days of all sorts of rumors, and it's hard to know what was common knowledge, but apparently Yirmiyahu had made a prophecy that people had kept in their minds, a 70-year prophecy that Bavel would only be in power for 70 years. Now that came true. So anyone thinking about Yirmiyahu would know that the prophecy Yirmiyahu made had come true. And now Yirmiyahu had also said that at that point they'd start building. So the cloud of Yirmiyahu, and then you also have another guy who doesn't show up in this book, but in the previous book, is Daniel. Okay, Daniel was a high-powered, similar to the way we think of Yosef, but probably not that as high. And Daniel lived until the first year of Cyrus. At least that's the way the text says it. So he was there pushing, and Daniel was very committed to this concept. There's a time to rebuild the temple. He has some crazy numbers about Mashiach. It's always good to say anything you're not allowed to study, people will study, right? And every time people say you're not allowed to count, try to figure out what the numbers are, that didn't stop the Rambam, and all of them to try to figure out how many generations would be before Mashiach. So Daniel was focused on the future. Yechezkel had a new temple in his mind, and he shared it with people when he was in Bavel. So did they want to join? I don't know.
They are to be given daily without fail, whatever they need of young bulls, rams, or lambs, as burnt offerings to the God of heaven, and wheat, salt, wine, and oil, at the order of the priests in Jerusalem.
Again, God of heaven, Dishmaya. Alan, what does it say in Aramaic in verse 9, God of heaven? Unmute yourself.
Sorry. Le'ela Shemaya.
Shemaya, right? The God of heaven.
God of heaven.
Yep.
But I wanted to, can I interject something as long as I unmuted myself?
Yes, you can interject. You've been
Okay.
patient.
There is a single tablet that has survived the proclamation of Cyrus just when he ascended to power. And it seems that what he writes is that all the temples that were destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar are now given permission to be rebuilt. He's encouraging the people to feel liberated, that they could all go back and rebuild their temples.
Right, so that was the style of Cyrus, to give back local authority rather than try to bring all the power in one location. And yeah, so we know that certain kings were very much sensitive to the local needs and allowing them to behave in any way they wanted. Okay, so thank you.
Okay.
Okay, 10.
So that they may offer pleasing sacrifices to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his son.
Not a bad addition, right? Bring karbanos, I'm giving you all the animals, and also pray for us.
I also issue an order
This is really powerful.
that whoever alters this decree shall have a beam removed from his house, and he shall be impaled on it, and his house confiscated.
So he tried to send a message that things weren't going to. Now it turns out Nebuchadnezzar had similar terms in Sefer Daniel. Okay.
And may the God who established his name there cause the downfall of any king or nation that undertakes to alter or damage that house of God in Jerusalem. I, Darius, have issued the decree that it be carried out with dispatch. Then Tatanai, governor of the province of beyond the river, Shahar Bozanai, and their colleagues carried out with dispatch what King Darius had written. So the elders of the Jews progressed in the building, urged on by the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah son of Edo. And they brought the building to completion under the aegis of the God of Israel and by the order of Cyrus and Darius and King Artaxerxes of Persia. The house was finished on the 3rd of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of.
So that's 4 years of work. Go ahead. Israelites.
The Israelites, the priests, and the Levites, and all the other exiles celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy. And they sacrificed for the dedication of this house of God 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and 12 goats as a purification offering for all of Israel according to the number of tribes of Israel. They appointed the priests in their courses and the Levites in their divisions and for the service of God in Jerusalem, according to the prescription in the book of Moses.
Okay, so this ends. Yeah, they built the second temple. We don't get a clear description of how big it was. Okay, so this wraps up because the next chapter starts with the real Ezra showing up 50 years later.
Can I ask a question?
The original population was like
Can you hear me?
40,000.
Yeah, 1 second. Is there any water I can get? Water. Okay, he's getting it. Yeah, what? Alan,
I'm a little surprised by the term Kichtav Sefer Moshe, according to the book of Moshe.
I have to read this home again.
What do you think exactly that's doing there? Is that the description of the Mishkan being built? What do you think?
no, it's not the Mishkan, but they want to bring it back to the original authority. But right now, I have to take a break because my stomach is bothering me.
Okay.
So the big question is for all of you, what did you get out of these 3 weeks? What will you remember from it?
Which year was it that they finished the Beit HaMikdash?
Well, let's finish with Ezra, the last that we find things.
Okay, so this is 21 years after they came back.
According to the,
Right. So if you go to the first page of the handout,
so 458. it
no,
says.
no, before that, at the beginning, because we're talking about the first Darius.
522 to 486.
Right, but it says Second Temple began in 250, 520, and finished in 516.
516.
4 years later.
And
So
as you pointed out, if the first temple was destroyed in 586, it's exactly 70 years.
so wait a minute, so it finished 516 and lasted until the year 70, 80?
Okay, that wasn't a temple that lasted.
Oh,
King Herod built a whole new edifice.
oh, but it was destroyed later by,
Right, much later. And I have no idea, the Chashmonaim never described what the temple looked like. We know that there was a courtyard, but we don't know what it looked like. So I don't know. We have the authorization from Cyrus for 60 cubits. I don't have any idea how big it was.
but later on it was embellished by Herod.
Built by Herod. I don't know, it was more than embellished.
He built it.
He built whatever, the palace, the temple, yes.
So this one was destroyed by the time of Herod?
Again, you can build on the same property, right? Okay. This shul, right? We just rebuilt it.
Yeah, that's rebuilt, but mostly it wasn't.
Okay, so this one mostly wasn't, but you can rebuild. But in that time, it was most likely it was torn down because they built with simple stone and wood. They didn't have any much gold to elaborate. And King Herod built this magnificent palace, right?
Yeah,
That became one of the wonders of the world.
and how long did that last?
That's about 100 years. I don't know. When did Herod build it? He built it before BCE, right? It was, maybe
Probably
100,
70 AD.
I think closer to 100, maybe even 120. I don't remember the King Herod timeline.
Now, hello? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Now, Herod built it around 20 BCE, something
Okay,
like
20 BC, so less than 90 years.
One of the things you said about the Mishkan, when they had the Chanukas bias of the Mishkan, you made a point last week of saying that there was representation from each Shaved. So here, actually, it does say a little bit, it gives a little bit of credit to the Shvatim, because it says about the sacrifice.
Yeah, for all, according to the number of tribes of Israel.
For the Shvatim. Very big.
Right, in verse
The
17.
12 goats as purification offering for all of Israel according to the.
So they wanted to keep track that there was 12 tribes, even though they weren't 12 tribes. So that when they brought Karbanos, as Tammy pointed out, at the end of verse 17, they specifically had 12 animals slaughtered to symbolize that there were originally 12 tribes.
What was the population at the time when they finally completed the second temple? So it was 40,000 initially.
Right,
Had
so,
it grown or?
okay, so one of the things we don't know how it grew, but we know from a lot of experiences that people who make Aliyah don't always stay. So in the early 1900s in Israel, there was a major push to increase the Aliyah. And many of those left, went back to where they came from. So there's no way of knowing. We don't have any sense. The last text we have is Malachi. That's the last of the Nevi'im. I'm drawing a blank on what he says, but there's nothing that gives you any sense. We basically have until the Chashmonaim, we have a 100-year gap. The Chashmonaim are, Alan, when are the Chashmonaim about? Oh, it's Alexander. Right?
Hashmonaim are 165 BCE, but they didn't come into any government until 145 BCE.
Okay, Alexander would have been about what, 180?
No, Alexander was in 323 BCE. It
So
took a
what?
long time from Alexander till Antiochus.
Right. So but again, Alexander, our tradition showed respect for the Jewish people, but again, we have no sense of the population. It's very hard to know what the populations were in these places. And then there's another thing, when we get to Nehemiah, Ezra Nehemiah, one of the most startling things in my mind is the last 3 verses in all of Tanakh, leaving aside Divrei Yamim. It warns the Jews of the land of Israel not to intermarry. That was the last thing that the Navi said, that they shouldn't be intermarrying, was the last message. So there's a whole issue of intermarriage, which is all about Ezra and Nehemiah are all about the intermarriage problem. Ezra came, the main purpose of Ezra, which is on the last page, page 8, Ezra was primarily interested in only one thing, and that's verse 6, that Ezra came up from Babylon, a scribe expert in teaching of Moses, which the Lord God of Israel had given, whose request the king had granted in its entirety, thanks to the benevolence of the Lord towards him. So Ezra's own primary job was to recreate and empower the religion of Israel, because at this point, all they had was a temple and sacrifices. In Ezra and Nehemiah, you'll see the problems they had with Shabbos. You'll see the problems they had with business on Shabbos. You'll see stories about all the non-Jewish merchants. They were pretty sharp. They would hang out around the walls of Jerusalem on Shabbos, and maybe some Jews would come out. And even if they wouldn't come out, they'd be there right when Shabbos was over so they could sell. Nehemiah eventually issued edicts against, because he really didn't want them during the day, because people would go, it's a good shopping day, right? And, you're not working, it's a good shopping day. So Ezra and Nehemiah talk about intermarriage, and Nehemiah talks about the decrees he established to protect Shabbos. And also Nehemiah, and this we have at least one archaeological record of, Nehemiah did build the walls of Yerushalayim, and we have one wall that they attribute to Nehemiah in the archaeological digs. It's called, I think, Nehemiah's Wall or something like that. What? Okay, it may have fit the directions. And again, the starting point is how old is the wall. Once they can say, well, how old the wall is, they can attribute it to that time period. Right, but graffiti, Even the New York subways figured out a way to get rid of graffiti.
Same time?
Again, these are series of times that the Tanakh isn't always very good at putting exactly so you can see it clearly. So we covered 20 years of Cyrus, a king Cambyses, which we didn't talk about, and Darius. And we get through 6 years of Darius when the temple was finished. Okay, and Darius was known to be a builder. He had a reputation just as being a great builder in general. That's all we know. 50 years later, right, on the last page, what does it say? After these events, during the reign of Artaxerxes, right? And if you read verse 8, arriving in Jerusalem in the 5th month in the 7th year of the king. 7th year of the king. If you go to my first page, Artaxerxes started in 465. This would have been 458. Ezra shows up in 458. The first Aliyah shows up in 536. The temple is finished somewhat in 516, 16 and 44. So he arrived 60 years after the temple was completed or built.
And when did Nehemiah come? Did they come at the same time?
Yeah, okay. So Ezra came on his own initiative, okay? And he was motivated by spiritual things. He brought only 1,000 people with him. He stopped at a river and celebrated Pesach. He didn't have enough Levium, so he had to gather in the Levium. He then shows up in Yerushalayim. It doesn't look like he announces anything for a few days. And then his main mission was, the first thing he tries to do is to get the people who married non-Jews in the community to separate from their wives, especially the priests. Nehemiah, I don't remember whether it's 5 or 10 years later. Nehemiah is a major power behind the throne, and he gets a report. He hears story. After at the time of Ezra, which is 458. 50 years after this time period. So he hears reports that the land of Israel is not doing too well, probably like Rothschild got, and he takes the initiative and he gets authority from the king at that time, and he comes with an army. Yeah, he doesn't want to travel alone. Ezra just traveled with the Jews with him. Ezra gets a military force to accompany him all the way to the land of Israel. He doesn't announce he's there for 3 days. Nehemiah doesn't announce he's there for 3 days, and then he issues a public announcement, and they start building, and he creates a military. He conscripts people to work in the Beis Hamikdash. Eventually conscripts people to move to Yerushalayim because no one wanted to live there. So he takes more credit. Ezra was the spiritual leader. Ezra was the one who stood on the balcony and read the Sefer Torah. But Nehemiah was standing by his side at all time. And Nehemiah pushed the observance of Shabbos. So it wasn't just a political leader. Chazal were for whatever reason, Chazal raised the star of Ezra and diminished the star of Nehemiah. That's a good question.
It was just Ezra, and Nehemiah was more.
Again, but Ezra was the spiritual, reinvigorating the spiritual dimension. And Ezra went back and forth. It wasn't just he came there, he went back. What seems to happen, Chazal come up with a reason for why they don't want Nehemiah to get much credit. It's like the examples when they're looking for an excuse, and I don't know why. In the last verse of the chapter of Nehemiah, Nehemiah makes a statement to the following effect: God, please remember everything I've done to try to rebuild Jerusalem. That's what he asked. Remember what I did, even if I wasn't that successful. Chazal said, now, that was really a bad thing, and that's why the book is called really Ezra, not Ezra and Nehemiah. Again, Ezra is viewed as leading the reestablishment of, and that's why he's called worthy to get the Torah like Moshe. He leads to the reestablishment of the religion. He creates the rabbinic law. I mean, we had individual rabbinic law. but we never had something like the Anshe Knesset Agdola, the 120 people.
So Ezra established it.
Well, I don't, again, it's never mentioned in Tanakh.
So how do we know?
So we have this, if you read Pirkei Avos, this one went to this one went to that one. And Rav Soloveitchik,
Bible doesn't say that Ezra established.
No. no. But one of the important things that Rav Soloveitchik always mentioned him multiple times, and I claim that's part of the reason he didn't put down his own stuff in writing. He said, we don't know any of the names of the Anshe Knesset Genoa, and yet they established people. He says, the main point is, there's no need to be remembered by your name for what you did.
Well, there were 70 of them.
No, this is 120.
Oh.
Anshe Knesset was bigger, right? But we didn't know their names, any of the names. We knew maybe the two leaders, right? The twins, the two, and Rav Soloveitchik often said, one doesn't have to remember the names of the people who had an impact. That's not necessarily that important.
Was Cheskel still alive?
Cheskel would have been, well, Cheskel,
He went to Babylon with the people.
Yes, that's it.
right, Cheskel went to Babylon 10 years before the base of Mikdash was destroyed. Okay, so he might have been 40, depends upon how you read the first verse in Yecheskel. So that would have been with Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had 50 more years of reign. There's no reason to think that Yecheskel would have lived to see Cyrus. We know Daniel lived to see Cyrus because that's the last verse about Daniel. So he lived to the first year of Cyrus. So Yecheskel and Daniel overlapped. Daniel was a teenager when he came to Babylon. He was a part of a group of teenagers. And Yecheskel was probably 40 by that time. And Yirmiyahu was also alive. So I don't know how old he was. Yirmiyahu was living in Egypt by that time, not in Bavel. And the one that went to Bavel was Ezra's primary scribe, right, Baruch Ben Neriah, right. So yeah, it's hard to, that's why I've made that first page and I keep printing because I can't remember what the years are. And I'm good at mathematics. Okay, that wraps it up.
Thank you.
Yes, so Esther, it might have been around the same time. When the temple was being rebuilt, Esther may have been alive. Or certainly when the temple was already rebuilt, because he was Achashverosh.
Yes.
Yeah. Wait, was that the same for sure?
The one on the front pages.
That's the one for her?
Yep. So she was alive after the temple was rebuilt, but before Ezra and Nehemiah came.
Mordechai was deported.
Okay, so now you're dealing with
That's
what?
100 years earlier.
Okay. You have to be careful. Okay. Mordechai was not an unusual name.
Yeah.
Okay? So, I mean, if you look on the last page that I handed out, yeah. What's Ezra's name? Ezra, son of Sariah, son of Azariah, which would have been Ezra, of Hilkiah, son of Shalom, son of Achita, son of Amariah, son of Azariah. The concept that this name might be used more than once. Now, Chazal want to make it that it's the same person. But we have no reason to believe he lived that long.
No, they're just saying, I think it's in the.
No, his name is mentioned, but that doesn't mean it's the same Mordechai.
But you said Esther could still alive.
No, again, that's a different Mordechai. The two Mordechais is my assumption. And Esther was with the second Mordechai. Is Esther, but he didn't leave Bavel. He wasn't part of the exile from Bavel.
No.
That would have been 150 years earlier. It's another person named Mordechai, just like we know there were multiple people named Daniel. But Chazal tried to conflate it and make it the same person. Okay. Okay, have a good day. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you. Continuing this, or is this the last of it? I didn't know there was a series.
And thank you from Roz too.
Okay. Yeah, this is the end of the three.
Oh, okay. I missed the first few. Our grandchildren were here.
I don't understand how you let family get in the way of important things.
Really? You don't
And
know.
and the only reason why I don't understand is because I'm jealous.
Oh, you're jealous. I don't know. I think you have your family.
It's not one of the Aseres Adibros I can't be jealous for.
All right, be well. We'll see you.
Okay.
Bye.